This is ChangeMakers with Katie Gore, finding the right solutions for the affordable housing community.
Welcome back to my conversation with Jeff Olivet, the Executive Director of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. We've been talking about Jeff's more than 2 decades of experience in working to eradicate homelessness. And now, Jeff, I really want to shift over to the current role that you were appointed to this year. Secretary Fudge said that you stood out from a very competitive field of candidates. So talk to me about the strategy that's in place at the federal level now.
First of all, it is a tremendous honor to be in this role and to be tapped by President Biden and Secretary Fudge, who chairs our council, to run the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. And I see a huge opportunity for the federal government to lead the way on this. I say lead the way. That doesn't mean the federal government can solve all homelessness. I think the solutions get played out at the local level and require very, very strong local leadership, as well as funding and support and mobilization of all aspects of the community response. I believe that homelessness is a multi-system failure. You talked about it being a complex, multifaceted issue. It certainly is. If we think about the pieces of the puzzle, it's kind of simple. We need housing, we need good healthcare access and behavioral health supports for people. We need educational opportunity and job training and good income supports. There are a lot of pieces that you can kind of look at and say, you know, here's a set of strategies that need to align to end homelessness at the individual level. At the societal level, we have been building for decades toward this public policy failure. Homelessness didn't just happen overnight. And in fact, homelessness has a history that goes back 450 years on this land, really since the early days of the colonial expansion, the arrival of colonists, and then the expansion across the country. We saw massive displacement of indigenous people. We saw genocide of Native people. We saw the enslavement of African people that resulted in, generational poverty and disenfranchisement that lasts even till today. So these are deeply rooted issues. And the homelessness that we see today didn't just start. We saw a huge increase in the late 70s and early 80s that's driven by a number of factors, including the movement from institutionalized mental health care to community-based care without the appropriate housing and supports in place to keep people from becoming homeless. We've seen veterans returning from wars. We've seen the increase in family homelessness through the 80s and 90s, and youth homelessness on the increase. Right now, the fastest growing segment of the homeless population in many communities are elderly folks over the age of 60. So we've failed in multiple arenas. And when I got into homelessness work, I thought homelessness was a social issue. And what I have come to realize is that it is not a singular issue. It's certainly not a type of person or a homogenous group. It is a multi-system failure. And when we start looking at all of those systems that play into who becomes homeless, that their failures often play into who becomes homeless, foster care and child welfare, criminal justice, education, our health systems, our behavioral health systems, our ability to engage and mobilize economic opportunity for people. If we're going to solve homelessness, we've got to solve it at a multi-system level. That's what gets hard about it. At the individual level, we actually see huge successes all the time. We see hundreds of thousands of people exiting homelessness successfully every year, and yet we see just about as many coming into homelessness. And so it's not a static group that stays homeless forever. People are constantly successfully exiting homelessness, accessing mental health care and drug and alcohol treatment and jobs and education and reconnection. And at the same time, more folks keep falling into homelessness. So we've got to figure out the multi-systems part. We've also got to figure out the upstream prevention part.
One of the things that you're describing is a more comprehensive approach, really even looking at equity and justice within the homelessness and within the structures. Tell me more about how does equity and justice help, or at least addressing and recognizing that? How is that going to help solve some of what you've described here?
It's important to note that people of color are dramatically more likely than their white counterparts to become homeless across the country and in communities across the country, north, south, east and west, large and small. African Americans are represented in the homeless population at a rate of about 3 to 1 compared to their general population numbers. In many communities, the proportionality of Native people, of Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders are through the roof, even higher than the African American disproportionality numbers. So the first thing we need to do is acknowledge that, look very carefully at the data, not just around who's becoming homeless, but around barriers to exit homelessness, which affect people of color as well, discrimination in housing and jobs, et cetera. Then we need to figure out solutions that are deeply focused on reducing that racial inequity. And that involves how we design housing programs, how we conduct outreach to communities that are most at risk of homelessness, how we deploy prevention resources prior to the point of eviction, prior to the point of somebody calling up the shelter in crisis. So I think there's a kind of recognition that is increasingly happening and needs to continue to happen. And then there's a response that I think we're just now at the front edge of right now around really implementing equitable strategies that reduce racial inequities in who becomes homeless, how long they stay homeless, what their long-term housing outcomes are.
You mentioned discrimination in housing, and there's a correlation with existing fair housing laws, but those are sometimes not enforced or situations are not always reported. So what is happening in that arena as it relates to homelessness?
The Fair Housing Act, when it was passed in 1968, is really another just tremendous move forward in the historical progress of civil rights for many groups, certainly for people of color, but for around gender discrimination, around LGBTQ protections, around supporting people with disabilities. And it was a tremendous piece of legislation that has never fully been enforced, never fully lived up to its potential. This administration, following in the footsteps of the Obama administration, has committed to affirmatively furthering fair housing and really looking at trying to put some teeth into the enforcement side of fair housing. I've seen a real disconnect in my career between the homelessness sector and the fair housing sector, if you want to think of it that way. And at the federal level, what we're trying to do is make sure that we're doing everything we can to connect the dots between homelessness and fair housing. At the local level, what I would hope is that the homeless response systems and the fair housing organizations, both the governmental ones and non-governmental ones, legal advocates and others, are connecting with each other. I think there's not always good coordination and good collaboration at the local level. Maybe some communities do this better than others, but I would like to see much more education around fair housing within the homelessness sector, much more a kind of quicker referral to legal advocacy when discrimination does happen. I think there's a reality that when people are homeless, they don't always have the time and luxury of following through on a claim around discrimination because they just need a place to be. And often their housing navigator or case manager or advocate might just move on to the next landlord rather than take the time to go after a landlord that's overtly or covertly discriminating against people. So I do think we need to do a lot more to connect the dots at the national level and at the local level on this.
In addition to the existing laws, we've also mentioned just a few minutes ago the funding that's being expanded, and that is a current administration priority, but there's also been severe underinvestment over the years. How do you think, in tandem, in a combination between the underinvestment in many years prior and then the current funding that's moving to expand affordable housing, how do you think the landscape may change if the American Rescue Plan or the CARES Act funding or, whatever the piece of legislation, how do you think that dynamic is going to roll out in real time for the population that you're trying to serve?
It's a really great question, Katie, and I think the important thing to remember is that we didn't get here by accident. In 1970, we had a surplus of more than 300 units of affordable housing for the lowest income renters. Over the period between the mid-70s and the early 2000s, this is Democratic administrations and Republican administrations, federal investment in housing assistance dropped by something like $28 billion. And so for the last couple of decades, we've just been playing catch up. And what we find today is that across the United States, there's a shortage of almost 7 million units for low-income renters. What that means is that for every 100 extremely low-income renters, only 37 affordable units are available to rent. If you think about that gap between 37 and 100, it's a wonder we don't have more homelessness. I think so many people are living right near the edge in either substandard housing they can't sustainably afford, maybe they're doubled up with friends or family, and that sort of disinvestment over many decades has really laid the circumstances in which we find ourselves now. And the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan I think they do infuse once in a generation, certainly once in my lifetime, level of resources that we're now seeing real progress in how those are being utilized. I'm very hopeful about home ARP funds. These are the home dollars that were released under the American Rescue Plan to really focus on sustainable solutions to homelessness. We're seeing deployment of emergency housing vouchers in very smart ways in a lot of communities to shore up the housing solutions for folks who are homeless. I think we've seen the impact of the emergency rental assistance over the last couple of years really prevent a lot of homelessness from happening in the first place. I do have a concern about what happens now around evictions and what happens now as those rental assistance funds are being fully deployed. I think we need to have a real national conversation about eviction prevention as well.
Well, we've talked about federal funding mostly here, but what roles are state and local governments taking when it comes to combating this affordable housing crisis?
We have certainly seen a number of states pass huge appropriations to address homelessness in California and Washington and other states. We've seen localities like Austin, Texas, mobilize local dollars with philanthropic dollars, with corporate dollars from the tech industry to come up with really comprehensive solutions to homelessness. So I think the important lesson there is that no single entity can do this alone. We need the federal government to step up, but we also need very strong state and local leadership. We need strong commitment from the philanthropic community and the corporate sector, the faith community, and others to really step up and pay for this stuff. I do want to make an important point about how we think about who's at the tables, because everybody I just mentioned could be considered sort of powerful people. The powerful people we need at these tables also include people who have themselves experienced homelessness, people who are homeless now or who have experienced the traumatic experience of life on the street or in the shelter. Those are the folks closest to the problem, and those are the folks who are going to be able to think through and help design the best solutions. So we need to combine the sort of traditional political and economic power with the power of lived experience to create the most effective solutions to homelessness.
Speaking of an effective solution to homelessness, what can you tell us about the House America initiative?
House America has been a national effort spearheaded by my agency, the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, and HUD under Secretary Fudge's leadership to really help communities figure out how to best use these once-in-a-generation resources through the American Rescue Plan. We've had more than 80 communities sign on. HUD has shown tremendous leadership in mobilizing support from mayors and governors and county administrators with the national goal of having more than 100,000 new affordable housing units in the pipeline by the end of this year. That's been incredibly effective at the local level. We've seen communities deploy thousands of units of affordable housing for people experiencing homelessness, set goals, move very thoughtfully toward those goals. It really is an effort to both align the resources that are available and also create peer learning across the communities. So there's a growing conversation among these mayors and city officials and state officials about what's working and what barriers they're finding, how they're overcoming those barriers. There really is a kind of peer-to-peer learning community growing up around House America. So my push for your listeners would be find out if your community is already on board. We keep a list of House America communities up on the website. And then if your community is not on that list, push your mayor, push your county officials, push your state officials to get involved.
That's a good takeaway and action item for our listeners. One other question that I have for you, and it's something that when people first come to Quadell, we have a lot of our employees write passion statements to make sure they understand why they're doing what they're doing. And if you were going to write a passion statement for why you're doing what you're doing, what would you say it is your passion statement for Jeff Olivet?
I want to be part of the work of making this nation and this world in which we live more equitable, more just, and more caring, where we take care of one another. We make sure that housing is a basic human right and not something to be earned, and that I plan to be in this work until homelessness is a thing of the past.
Well, Jeff, thank you for this perspective and actions of what's happening and ways to get involved and really explaining the issues on a more personal level for what the individual is really going through when they experience homelessness. Jeff, it's been great to have you here.
It's been great to be with you today. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to ChangeMakers with Katie Gore. To find out more about Katie, go to quadell.com. That's QUADEL.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.